Welcome, welcome, everyone. Good morning, good morning. My name is Nadia Barsch, executive at LRMG, and we are super excited to welcome you to our first Workforce Readiness and Anti-Fragility webinar. Today, we are going to be having a fast-paced, insight-driven conversation. Today's world is changing so fast. It's a constant. AI is shifting, demographics are changing, and global uncertainty is a constant. Ultimately, we often talk about resilience, but resilience alone isn't enough anymore. Resilience helps us recover, but anti-fragility helps us renew. And the bridge between the two is workforce readiness. Ultimately, what we are thinking about at LRMG is how ready are our people, our teams, and our systems to absorb shock, adapt intelligently, and grow stronger because of it. At LRMG, we support our clients through these challenges using the Workforce Readiness Compass through the lenses of visibility, skills, agility, and inspiration. These are the levers that move organizations from simply surviving to continuously evolving. And today we explore these ideas through 5 sharp, fast-paced jolts, each one designed to challenge our thinking and reveal new ways to strengthen our organizational readiness. To help us make sense of it all, I'm joined today by Dr. Craig Wing, who ultimately lives at the intersection of foresight and strategy. Welcome, Dr. Craig Wing. Welcome to South Africa. Which country are you in now? Just want to check. You are in South Africa, right? You've been from Timbuktu to Russia.
I have indeed. Thanks for having me, Nadia. I appreciate it. Yeah, so was down in Cape Town for 3 days, and just before that, I was in Hyderabad. I lectured at the Indian School of Business. Just before that, I was in Russia, and before that, absolutely correct, I was in Kenya, and that was all in the last 2.5 weeks. But I am back in Johannesburg.
I must be honest, Craig, my favorite was Timbuktu. So hashtag just saying. So let's do a quick intro for Craig. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Craig Wing, a PhD qualified futurist, entrepreneur, author, and global keynote speaker whose passion lies in helping leaders and organizations make sense of uncertainty and shape the future with confidence. With over 20 years of experience, including a PhD, MBA, and MSc, Craig brings both academic depth and practical foresight. He has delivered more than 600 keynotes and lectures to over 6,000 leaders across 40 countries, translating complex signals and trends into actionable strategies that drive resilience and growth. In his latest book, The 4 Future Seasons, which debuted at number 6 in South Africa and number 1 on Amazon's hot sellers list, offers a fresh and practical way of thinking about the future and how leaders can prepare for it. Beyond that, Craig has co-authored 2 other books and developed What the Foresight, an AI-powered diagnostic tool that helps organizations assess their future fitness. And that's the data that we're going to be using today. So I'm super excited because what we're going to be doing is use the data that Craig has pulled from all of these organizations into our conversations today. So it's really going to be catalyst conversation starters to use that data and explore through the lens of workforce readiness and anti-fragility. What can we learn as organizations? What do we need to do and think differently so that we can actually navigate the current context with a level of support from how we can actually support each other and create a community of practice. So before we dive in, let's frame why this conversation matters. Workforce readiness goes far beyond skills or training. It's about whether your organization can sense change early, can mobilize energy around it, and use disruption as fuel for growth. And fragility ultimately hides in plain sight. In engagement scores, they say we're fine while energy is flat, or in leadership dashboards that measure activity but not volatility. When disruption hits, fragile organizations break. Ready organizations bend, learn, and renew. And that's what we're trying to almost bottle today in the conversation. What are the organizations, the data telling us, and how can we bottle this to say, what do we need to learn and do so that we can actually navigate this more effectively? So let's begin with the first jolt today, inspiration. So ultimately, it's our first anchor for workforce readiness. Inspiration is the organization's energy currency. It's the sense of purpose, meaning, and connection that fuels performance. Research from Gallup and World Economic Forum shows that inspired employees are more than twice as productive. Yet many organizations treat inspiration as intangible. So when energy flatlines, fragility follows. Craig, let's talk through your first graph. Tell us the data that you got from this organization, and yet let's use the inspiration lens to kind of unpack what that means.
Okay, great, Nadia. So before we do that, perhaps let me give you an overview of the research, and I think this will help frame the conversation so we can understand where we're coming from, so the listeners can see what's going on. So essentially, what happened was the PhD is based off, all the way from 15 years of corporate experience within this futures domain, but more specifically, trying to answer the research question: what do companies do to succeed in the future? This was then essentially a mixed method analysis where I interviewed several CEOs, executives, directors who had followed something called a backcasting approach. Now, I'm just giving you a bit of technicalities. I don't want to go too far into the specifics, but the key outcome is this. Based off the research of these leaders, where we essentially said, what did you do to ensure that your companies were able to succeed in the future? What popped out were 25 key different attributes over here. And the 25 attributes fall very nicely into three areas. So there's the bucket of leadership, the bucket of organization, the bucket of landscape. Leadership encompasses attributes like mindset, vision, and values, alignment, team leadership. Organization encompasses these orange pieces over here, and landscape are these green ones over here, right? So that's essentially the positioning of the research. It comes through, and we now see that we have these 25 different factors. A survey then goes through, which then leverages off sentiment analysis and swarm theory to help us understand where an organization lands up. So that's the baseline of this. All the data then is based against this framework in the sense that it's all case studies, real case studies of organizations that have understood this theory, understood this approach, and then have also then sent the survey out to their teams. And that varies all the way from just the exco to maybe middle management, perhaps the entire organization, to gauge essentially the perception of where they are. Why perception? Because your perception drives your reality. And much like the topic of this conversation right now, it's really the perception that drives the reality of where we end up as organizations. And I think the 5 jolts that we have will really start to bring that to light. So that's the basis of the conversation.
Thanks, Craig. So what is as we look at these, firstly, we know that organizations do these analysis all the time. What stood out for you the most from the research that you did, and what signals of fragility are we actually missing because our dashboards don't, and what our dashboards don't measure?
Yeah. So let me just talk you through this. And there's one piece that's really important. One of the biggest insights I suspect off this graph, and forget about the crazy Big Bang Theory mad, statistics and numbers over here. Let me walk you through the key insight. The biggest insight here was essentially the ability for us to actually measure leadership. I'll come back to your question around energy and dashboards shortly. We've all used when we've used and we've heard the term, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But what does that really mean, and how do we understand that, right? So a big part of this was about understanding what is the leadership premium. And leadership here in this context that I found out was leadership, as I've defined it, the blue stuff, it counts 50% more than the orange stuff. And you can see that articulated in the values over here. So when you normalize it around organization, around the organizational metrics that most companies will focus on, where most organizations focus their dashboards on, specifically around typically financial metrics, what you see that leadership counts 50% more. So the blue stuff counts 50% more than the orange stuff, all things being equal. How does this tie into your question around fragility and signals of energy? Well, it's significant because it's typically what happens is this. Typically what happens is that most dashboards tend to measure financial output. They tend to measure financial output or some kind of productivity index. That masks and that hides fundamentally, essentially energy. All right. And that's the problem because you can have as much time, you can have as much output as you want, but if your energy is low, you're unable to measure that. As a result of which, some of the things that we're missing when we look at this is things like cognitive load. So there might be a huge amount of productive output that comes through in our dashboards. You've sold so many widgets, sales are like this. But the cognitive strain is a huge issue, and that comes through around some of the things we see today, around things like mental health, around huge amounts of fragile organizations because of fragile people, because we haven't kept up with that. The other big piece around energy that we don't necessarily speak about, it's really the question around social cohesion as well. And we don't speak about this in the context of organizations. It's the breakdown of the fabrication, or rather the breakdown of the connectedness that we have between the people in the organization, also outside and inside, because the numbers don't show that. The numbers show pure output. So there's a huge piece around fragility here that we don't see because we don't know how to measure it. And this research now shows us a way of doing that directly.
I know what you're saying, because we often sit with organizations, and what is more important is showing shareholder value, showing, how we've brought costs down. We've seen this year in particular, a lot of clients are downsizing so that they can show value to the shareholders. And the question I'm asking, just based on the data that you've just shared, is where are we actually measuring these leadership aspects? Because this is what's actually going to give us business impact. And I feel like that is the conversation that's not being had right now. There's a lot of focus on some of the monetary elements and operational elements to bring costs down. But what is the knock-on effect that we're having when we're downsizing, the people that are left behind, the ability for the organization to be able to really operate at that leadership premium level that you're describing, because that has the real impact. So I'm curious about the delta that we're seeing in where the data is coming through. These leadership aspects are actually super important, but what we seem to amplify in business is more operational costs, and that seems to be where the tension comes through.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back here again, and if you just glance at some of the orange things again, the orange stuff is typically what you see in a normal dashboard. It's our operational efficiency. It's how many widgets are we making? What's the level of our SAP integration, for argument's sake, right? All the way through to what's our ROI in terms of investment, not necessarily our ROE. Typically, to the question then directly that you've asked, is the dashboard measures this orange stuff. Why? Because it tends to be the easier metrics, number one, but also there's an easier correlation, there's an easier dotted line, there's an easier way to put it into our shareholders report. It's an easier way to say to our shareholders, this is how we make money, by investing in things like metric tracking. So we can actually show you where we make our money, right? And so this is the dashboard operational efficiency point of view, shall we say, which is what you're saying right now. But this stuff, the blue stuff, is the stuff we don't measure. And this stuff is the one that actually makes 50% more difference, all things being equal. So exactly to what you're saying right now, Nadia, part of the reason is the blue things don't show up in dashboards. It's very difficult to measure the level of alignment. The question around, have we fulfilled our vision and values? Are we checking the right way? It's far easier to say, well, what is the level of technology implementation? How many of our organization, people in our organization are using SAP? How many of them have dialed into our fancy new tool? How many of us in our organization have used the AI product, to use today's language, that we just paid millions of rand for, to upskill, right? As opposed to say, well, what does it mean from a team alignment point of view? And has this changed or altered our growth mindset to one that's about survivalist?
Yeah, and just observationally, as we're engaging with clients, I'm definitely noticing quite a survival mindset right now, just because of all the shifts that are happening, a lot of overwhelm in the market as well, just given the global economic conditions, and that's also having quite an impact. So it's very interesting to me that even though that's the data that's coming through, organizations aren't prioritizing it as much as they should. And as we think about workforce readiness, this is one of the things that we measure, is the inspiration gap. And then the conversations, they need to become, how do we shift our mindsets so that we start prioritizing this, that we create space for psychological safety, for trust, for more transformative conversations, so that we can actually start pivoting. Really love that data. Very, very insightful, Craig. Let's move on to the next jolt. I'm not seeing any questions around this one. And please put questions for Craig and for myself. This is really a conversation. It's a community of practice. It's here to support you. So please do put questions in the chat. We're going to be going through 5 different data points with Craig. This was the first one, and we're keen to engage in the next. So Craig, let's pivot to the next one. This is around agility. So agility is really not about moving faster. It's about moving smarter. It reflects a system's ability to sense, adapt, and pivot before being forced to. And too often agility is reduced to processes and jargon rather than organizational rhythm. So the experimentation rate, how often teams test, iterate, and learn, this is so critical for innovative organizations, and it's really a tangible indicator of agility. Let's look at the next graph, and I'd love you to talk us through firstly what the data is telling us, and then let's unpack it from there.
Sure. So I 100% agree with you around the concept around experimentation, which is actually one of the areas that we measure, right? So how do we determine the level of experimentation? What is our propensity to take risks? So there's actually a few metrics. One is experimentation, one is risk taking, and the other one is a lean and entrepreneurial approach. But the one that feeds out as a natural implication of this is then culture. So what does it mean? And again, I come back to the point that I said before, culture eats strategy for breakfast. This is a real organization. Obviously, I won't mention who they are. This is a real organization where I ran the survey, I ran the research, and I want you to really look at this bottom graph over here. And this bottom graph is telling, not from an agility point of view directly, but an output of agility, which speaks around cultural alignment. So if we look at this, how it's staged over here is on the left-hand side, it's your current culture score. So what is your perception around culture today between 1 and 10, with 0 and 10? And then on the right-hand side, the x-axis, what is your future view of the culture that we're going to be at? Not is the ideal. So this is not our ideal. This is the trajectory of where we are. And what you'll notice over here is you'll see 4 little bubbles over here. You'll see the blue middle management, pink or red over there, which is junior. We've got senior management, and then we've got executives. The right place you obviously want to be is far the top right. And just this graph alone shows us that executives are removed from the rest of the organization by 1 basis point in either direction. So out of sync, both in terms of where the realities of where we are today, but out of sync of the realities of where we think we're going to be in the future. Why is this important for agility? Why is it important for questions around saying, well, Craig, what does it mean for us? When agility is such an important driver around saying moving quickly, for understanding how we tie into this crazy world we're in right now, it's because this gives us the ability, the operating manual, shall we say, the OS in terms of how we do things. This organization, they're so out of sync that when I showed them the data, the executives actually turned around and said, this is great. This is what we want to see because we as executives drive the direction of the organization. And I think that just goes to show how out of touch they are with the realities of the rest of the company. So it's not about saying, well, we're driving the agenda, but rather we're mismatched. There's a premium that's associated over here. If they're not careful, this is going to run over time. This will become even more problematic both today and the future.
Such an interesting observation, and I'm sure this, if we had to do this across multiple organizations, Craig, I'm sure this would be quite a common trend, right? Because we're often seeing a disconnect between people who are actually executing and the people who are driving strategy, and then the disconnect between those. I'd love to unpack a little bit around how they took that conversation, because this is a critical challenge that we're all sitting with within businesses. When this was highlighted, how did this actually transpire, or how did the conversation go as we tried to surface that?
Yeah, one of the jobs we're going to talk about shortly is really how things change the longer you spend in an organization. So I'll pack that piece for a second, right? But really, how did this conversation unfold? It was a tough one. And again, I think it speaks to the data. Now, this is just around the culture element, right? So there's 25 different attributes that we get measured as well. This organization, this was the biggest mismatch around culture for the executives and everyone else. But this conversation was telling because in the room was just the executives. And this, I think, is part of the conversation that we need to have in more organizations, is bringing more voices in. Who should we be speaking to? There's no point really in speaking to, your 15 executives, showing them the data and going, you're out of sync with the rest of the organization. The head of HR, the executive of HR turns around and goes, that's great. That means our initiatives are working, because that changes the narrative completely. What we should have done is we should have said, let's just pause here. Let's bring in some of the other senior managers. Let's bring in some of the graduates. Well, let's take this data away and let's actually interrogate it. First of all, is this a true reflection of how we feel? It's the perception that drives reality. That's number one. Number two, if that's the case, why do you feel this way? And how do we close this gap? So in that point in time, in that conversation, it was received in a different kind of way that I think was intended to, and they interpreted the data the way they wanted. Again, in data science, it's called an overfitting bias. So we fit the data to our narrative, our point of view. And in this case, we're the executives, we drive the company. We should be further away from the rest of the organization because they follow us, versus the reality of saying we're so far away from the organization that we're out of touch in terms of how they feel and how they think.
It's interesting for me because ultimately agility is something that is so critical. I hear it in organizations, they say they're being agile, but culture is what informs our ability to be agile, the ability to collaborate and engage, and the trust that you have in order to do that at speed. I often talk about to my clients, we think about the next generation of organizations. They need to be fluid in the way they engage, like a murmuration of birds. They need to be able to clock each other, be able to move at speed. And it's that level of agility that allows you to move at the speed of market. But when we look at this level of data, there's a complete disconnect from being able to do that and what the executives are doing from a top-down level. So this feels very hierarchical. It feels like it's an organization that isn't able to be fluid as it needs to be to respond at speed of market, which is obviously always the concern within the current context.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add further, I mean, you touched on it, the cadence of how things are changing right now, again, whether it's technological, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's economic, the cadence is moving faster and faster externally that you need to up your agility premium, shall we say. You have to at least match what's going on out there. And if you don't, that delta just gets bigger. The drift becomes further and further and further. The problem is it's not just the agility. So yes, we can be agile and encourage you to be agile. It's the acceptance of the outputs of agility. And that's the other thing we don't speak about. It kind of ties to your energy point, right? So yes, folks, hi team, I'm the executive of operations. Yes, I want you guys to be agile. I want you to move and I want you to do this stuff. So they do it. They present me with a new way of working. They present me with a new way of doing whatever project we have. But it doesn't get accepted into the organization because the other pieces don't align. So we have a high agility factor, shall we say, but it's a low acceptance rate. That then ties into this increasing dissonance of energy, because I put all this energy into running experimentations to say, will the new way be better than the old way? I've got definitive results, but it doesn't get accepted by leadership because the organization isn't geared to take risks. So agility is one of those things where it ties into a number of different areas where the operating manual, i.e. culture, needs to be acceptance of that. And it's not just permission, but it's acceptance of. That's also a big part of this conversation.
So what I'm hearing you say is agility actually sits as like a base of your culture. It's rooted in your culture, but right from the beginning of a process, right to the end, our ability to move at speed, to also accept, and I suppose in that is also the ability to fail, to iterate, to move, because that's also part of an ability to accept what comes out of the agility process. Is if there's something where we failed, we need to also be able to accept that and to learn from it and to move. And I just from an observational perspective, anti-fragility, actually one of the key things is the ability to learn from failure, iterate and move forward. And I think sometimes, to your point, the outputs, isn't a tolerance for failure. That can also sometimes be quite damaging for people within an organization as well.
Yeah, but I mean, I think let's bring another lens to it, and let me show a little bit more data over here, because I think this might be really interesting, Nadia. There's another piece over here which is so incredibly powerful, and that's also the ability to say, well, how do we measure this stuff? So it sounds great, it sounds fantastic, but if there was a way that we could actually measure this, so we could actually understand agility or company values, which is a subsection of culture, what would that look like? So part of this is we now have those 25 different values that I've articulated for a company, and I can run this analysis for any company. Here's a company where we had a look at their values. So here's their values: consequence, stewardship, productivity, caring, creativity, together, passion, and happiness. And we could say these are the values of the organization. I can then create mathematical models based off those 25 attributes and actually measure these values. Why is that important? Is one, obviously, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we can't measure the values. What does it mean to us? Is it just a sparse value? Is it something that sits on our screensavers and our calendars and our board compact? Or can we actually measure that? So this is the first piece. But this is the piece that ties into the question around agility that you mentioned right now. If you have a look at this data for this company, for argument's sake, while they haven't got a specific value, which is agility, they have got a few that actually tie directly into it. Things like togetherness, okay? Things like productivity, things like stewardship. Now, what's important around this one then is if these are the values, and let's, for argument's sake, let's assume that we're talking about agility is the same as productivity. I know it's not the same, but let's assume that it is, because there's components of agility into being proactive. What you're seeing over here is you're seeing essentially a correlation analysis between said company's values, okay? There's a huge amount of statistical value, i.e. it's not insignificant. We can see the amount that it's correlated, i.e. We can see how strong the correlation is. So what does this mean in English? What this measures, this correlation efficient measures, is depending on how hot it is, how short your t-shirt becomes. So if it's very hot, we've got elbow length. If it's super duper hot, I'll wear a vest. If it's crazy hot, there's no top. So that's what it shows over here, right? So this is the correlation efficient. But the beta number is by how much. So for this company over here, productivity, for every 1 point increase in productivity, the value of the organization, we have a 1 point increase of profitability and value creation. So now this company can tie in directly a measure of productivity or agility, if this was the same thing, and profits. And this is now we can start seeing this question around what is dashboard showing us? Dashboards are showing us some of the outcomes, but it doesn't show us how do we measure certain intangibles. Here's another one that's really important. Again, in the context of energy, perhaps, right? For every 1 point increase in happiness, this organization showed an increase in perceived profitability and value creation of almost a 1-to-1 ratio. So there's another very interesting case study over here. We can start saying, well, what are these subcomponents and how do we now tie this language, which you know it's important, but into the language of business, into what we said earlier? Most of it is tied into shareholder value. It's tied into capital gains. It's tied into saying, well, how do we create money for an organization? I'm not saying either one is right or wrong. What I am saying is we found a way now that we can measure this and show the importance of this and the importance of values, agility, mindset, culture to profitability.
This is stunning. I love this data, and I love the happiness index as well. And thank you for interpreting that for us, Craig. Well, I'll speak for myself. That was very helpful that you interpreted that, all of that information, and helped to make sense of it. But I think what I got out of it essentially is that happiness is actually a really big part of how we can actually show ultimately business impact over the long term. And it's something that we should be cognizant of as we engage with our people. At least that's what I gained from some of it, because those intangibles are really hard to measure, but it showed that there was actually a correlation. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, you're spot on. So let me just articulate and double click on that happiness one. So happiness is a value of said organization. So they said, listen, sorry, said, not sad organization, right? So for this company, happiness was one of their values. We said, well, happiness, what is a subcomponent of? It's a subcomponent of things like teamwork, agility, customer centricity, and so on and so forth. So again, 25 attributes. How do you create a mathematical model to measure happiness for you as an organization? That then shows us almost a 1-to-1 correlation. Now, correlation is not causation, obviously, but the key point here is for every 1 point increase in happiness, there's a correlated, essentially 1 point increase in profits and value creation. So it doesn't say, we don't know which way the correlation goes. It could be happiness drives profitability. It could also be profitability drives happiness. But there could also be a third component, which is something else happens that drives both happiness and profitability. What you do know, though, is those two variables are very strongly correlated. And that's the key finding. So we can do the same thing around an organization's values, like one that a lot of organizations have, integrity or trust or teamwork, and find out that's specific only for that company. Just because happiness is a value for one company and it's a 1-to-1 ratio doesn't mean it's the same for another company where it might be less or even more.
Yeah, yes. And context matters. Brilliant, brilliant. Let's move on to the next jolt. Craig, clearly you and I can go into the data and continue, but let's continue for the next one, because I'm keen to explore inclusion and visibility. This one, for me, when you shared this initial data, it really caught my attention. Obviously, context matters, but as we think about visibility and our next anchor, what we see and what we choose to see is also quite important as we think about this. And when voices are unheard, fragility grows in silence. I really want to unpack the data from this particular graph, give us a bit of context, and let's unpack what it means. For me, the critical thing right now is, do our organizations actually have the visibility they need to make the right decisions? And this graph and this data is an interesting catalyst for that conversation. Over to you, Craig.
Yeah, so let me show you, and this is the first time I'm showing, the folks on the course. So don't be too overwhelmed. Just look at one of these sets of graphs for argument's sake, right? And I'll walk you through this very quickly. So what you're seeing right now is, earlier on, I showed you my primary research showed that there's 25 attributes that came through from the research to say, think about these things and you might be more resilient, more adaptive, more ready to survive in the future, for lack of a better word. We then took this and said, okay, here's a survey that goes through. Please send it to your organization and then rate where you are today and where you think you're going to be in the future. So what you're seeing is you see two set of curves. On the left-hand side, you're seeing the perception of today, and the right-hand side, the perception of tomorrow. Let me walk you through how to read this. From 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock, the blue stuff are the leadership characteristics. So you might recall mindset, vision, values, alignment, team, and leadership. From 2 o'clock through to 8 o'clock is then the organization stuff. There's the operations, technology that we spoke about. So this is the organization. This is typically what comes through in traditional metrics, traditional dashboards. From 8 o'clock through to 12 o'clock is then that last one that I don't really speak about that much, which is essentially landscape or marketplace. So we take this and we say, here's the survey. Let's plot it out on a set of graphs over here, right? In this instance over here, what you're seeing orange is the perception of the entire organization. So this is the entire sample size, n equals whatever the number was, and a subset of that in this situation over here was the filtered data, which is where n, the blue data, was just females. So those who identify and said that they're females, we can see both today on the left-hand side and the future on the right-hand side, that females poll consistently lower than the entire organization around all metrics of the organization, i.e., today, left side graph, right side graph, the future, females are less optimistic today and in the future. Now, again, this doesn't tell us why this happens, and it doesn't tell us if it's an issue. It just tells us it's a thing over here, okay?
Yeah.
To show you how pronounced this is, we can double click on this. So if you double click it again, I've now taken all of those things and I've said, okay, let's put in those three primary categories: leadership, organization, landscape. Again, the left-hand side is today, right-hand side is the future. What you see straight away is just look at the dot in the center. The first color, that one over there, the purple color versus the other purple color. I'm a guy, I can't tell you the difference between colors. But the first one, look at the dot. The dot between that one there and there is almost 1 basis point. It's reflected the same thing over there, same thing over here. It closes a little bit in the future. But the data shows us for this organization, there's a huge delta over a 1 point basis, right? So over a 1 point basis, there's a perception gap between males and females. Again, this doesn't tell us there could be a problem, but it's not saying it couldn't be a problem as well. This could be a biological imperative. We know other data shows us that men tend to overestimate their abilities and women tend to underestimate the abilities. We see this in things like when you ask a female, how much do you think you should earn? They tend to underplay what their premium is. They underplay their value. Does this come through in the graph? It might be, but it could also be something that's more symptomatic. This might be symptomatic or something that's might not be a lot greater. This could be showing us that says, even though we have females or we have women in leadership positions, they're not heard. That's why we're seeing this effect over here. It could be stuff like we don't even see women in executive roles, or the ones that are not having their voices heard. And that's why this perception comes through in both of these graphs over here.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think when you and I had a conversation about this particular data, I think context matters within this data as well. But it's hard to see, but I think it's also an interesting lens into the inclusion conversation that we need to continuously have. And for me, the critical thing is here, we're looking at visibility first, right? So it's a visibility lens. So you've given us some data, and do organizations actually test this is my first question. And how often are we testing it? How are we actually making sure that we're actually engaging our female leaders and just our general female population and actually engaging and understanding where they sit and how they feel connected to the organization, to the culture, to the vision, and whether they feel heard. And I think that's the hardest part of the data that you've shown. And I think observationally, it's something that it would be a red flag for an organization. It's something that they would need to address. And I suppose my question to you, Craig, is when you shared this data, what was the response? And how did they actually take that feedback?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I showed it in a mixed group. So there were both men and women, males and females. The ones I showed this data. Interesting enough, there was a lot of nodding of heads by the females. Ah, yes, and I don't know if that's validation of this is my lived experience, what I know. Paradoxically, I looked at the men, and there was, I don't want to say it was quizzical. There was almost like a blank expression, either because I didn't know this was the case, or I don't trust this data, which is a good place to start. Then we had the conversation. We started the conversation, and the question was very simple. Why do we think we see this effect, right? And the answers ranged all the way from stuff like biological imperative. All right. So yes, women underplay their strengths, men overplay their strengths. What you might not have seen in that data is it tends to normalize. It doesn't close the gap. It doesn't become equitable. It doesn't become equal in the future, but the gap does close. So the conversation started going around mostly around two factors. Is this just the way that women do things, underestimate versus men that overplay? That's number one. And if that's the case, what should women be doing better? Is it a question of visibility? Is it a question of saying the women in the room, the females in the room, need to speak more? Was it also a question incumbent upon executives to say, we need to ask the females in the room, why do they have this perception? Okay, so that was the first part of the question. The second part of the question is this truly representative? So over and above the natural, I don't want to use the term, but over a natural response, a biological response, is there something hidden, something we haven't seen that actually drives a potential huge red flag in the future? That conversation opened up a whole can of worms. Because then, again, thankfully, they were vulnerable, they're honest, and there were conversations around, without naming specifics, they were saying, yes, but if you think about it, I've been in meetings where female leader says A, B, C, D, and it just, the by numbers, she was one, and the male counterparts, which were more than one, tended to overshadow her opinion. Okay. And this came through a few times in different kinds of themes in that conversation. So this might be a real issue in the organization. I personally think it is, but it requires us to unpack it more. And a big part of this data is exactly that. It shows us where to go look for potential issues versus saying an issue exists.
Interesting, Craig, because the thing that's actually coming up for me more, as you mentioned how the women versus the men responded, is are we having a conversation with that business around allyship? So do we actually understand what allyship means? That men actually have to, rather than women constantly having to push their agenda, are men actually making sure that women have the space to be heard? Are we making sure that women have a platform? And ultimately, for me, what's actually coming out of that is, what is the allyship for men showing up for women where women are not in the room? And that's ultimately what allyship really stands for, is when we're not in the room, do you speak up and do you put us forward and make sure that we are actually, our voices are heard and our voices are elevated? And for me, that is actually the big question around the data that I'm seeing. And are women being allies for women in that space as well? So very hard data to see, hard to process. If I had to put my design hat on, I would say there's a strong piece around inclusion that's required, courageous conversations around how we're actually supporting each other. And rather than question the data, let's actually question each other in the room first and actually have a courageous discussion around, you know, what is my lived experience? If I'm an exec or if I'm in a senior role, is my voice actually heard? So yeah, very powerful. And thanks for that one, Craig. Really, really appreciated it. Just wanted to bring in, there's one question from John. He's mentioning that there's a really great case study, a Japanese tech company who set out to improve productivity and efficiency, and they focused on tracking a single metric. So thanks for that, John. Just trying to manage multiple screens. So thank you for your question. And please, team, bring your questions in. This is a community of practice. It's a conversation. And, you know, Craig is a real thought leader in the space, and you have an opportunity to engage with him on some really, really great topics and data that he's brought in. Craig, let's pivot to the next one. This was around renewal and intergenerational energy. Ultimately, this particular data for me also caught my eye. I think what was interesting for me as we go through this one is it sits at the intersection of agility and inspiration. And there's a crossover here. And it's really about maintaining energy and adaptability across generations. When we initially spoke about this one, it was around the age gap and how different perceptions see the business from an intergenerational perspective. And we all experience this. So we'd love you to talk us through some of this data. Talk us through what your insights were and what it is that we can learn from this.
So again, don't be too overwhelmed. I know when you see this, graphs, it might be a lot, but I'm going to walk you through them step by step, right? So the two graphs on the left-hand side, again, these two over here are today, and the two right-hand side in the future, right? So don't stress too much about that. You'll see that both set of graphs, so both the left and right, have then got three subsections: leadership, organization, landscape, leadership, organization, landscape, right? But what you're seeing is, look at the first set. So just this top row over here, you're looking at how essentially the perception, i.e. the values, vary by age. So there's the under 20s. There was only one person over here, so scrap that for now, or ignore that for now. But there were the 30 to 39-year-olds, call them the 30-year-olds, 40 to 49-year-olds, call them the 40-year-olds, 50 to 59-year-olds, called the 50-year-olds, and then one executive 60-year-old, right? So you can see that over there. What you see over here is you can see there's no debate that for age, for this organization, the older you are in the organization, your perception around leadership organization landscape drops dramatically across those age ranges, all the way from 1 basis point from each decade to each, right? Now, again, I'm just using this as a quick proxy. The effect, interesting enough, doesn't change over time. So even though the number becomes higher, the deltas between each one of those groups stays approximately the same. To double check this, because this is age, it may not correlate with tenure, right? So you might be someone who's younger or older, but you've only been at the company for a short amount of time. That's what we measure over here, right? So if you've been in the organization for less than a year is the purple one, 5 to 10 years is the green one, more than 10 years is 10, and you can see this effect. Now, this effect is not as pronounced, but what you can see definitively is you can see there's a drop of both with age and with time at the organization. This company doesn't show something that's really interesting with a lot of other organizations, is where it has like a hockey stick effect. So it comes down like this, and then at a certain age, normally above 60, it jumps up like that again. Okay. There's a few companies that show this hockey stick effect. And what is that showing us? It shows us typically organizations lose, individuals at organizations lose their bullish nature. They're less optimistic until you get to a certain age where you become an executive back up there, and then you drive the agenda. So therefore you are optimistic. Right? So that's what the data shows us from age and from tenure. Now, why is this important? If you're an organization, and let's just look at the top set for argument's sake, right? If you look at an organization and say, well, how do we match both energy? How do you match visibility? How do you measure all these different questions? You've got a huge challenge around fundamentally around transition. You've got a question around a workforce readiness around the next group. So as if this effect continues and it carries true, the longer you be at the organization over here, but also the age of people just means that people are less bullish. What you haven't seen in this data, so one of the questions you asked me before was, what is not in the data? I would love to be able to see, and this is what you can have from conversations, is how many of these folks that are between the ages of 50 to 59, more than 10 years, how many then subsequently leave the organization? Because if you find a correlation between age, tenure, and churn rate, then you can see we've got a huge issue around handing over the business to the next generation of leaders. I.e., we've got a huge issue around leadership transition. And this becomes a huge problem for organizations. So there's some very, very interesting pieces around this.
I do have a question in the chat from Beatrice asking, where's the data for 20 to 29-year-olds? Is there a bias in your data, Craig?
No. So it just happened that this organization only had one person be aged at the age between the 20 and 29 age. So maybe that itself is a great data point to say, well, why do we not have more folks in their 20s versus folks in their 30s? It could be all the way from we didn't hire them, we don't have them, plain and simple. We didn't include them in our sample size. We don't think they fit for purpose. So even that in itself is an interesting conversation to be had. Why don't we have folks in their 20s at this company?
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was fascinating when we went through it initially. And I suppose the concern that I would have looking at this is, how is this affecting our ability to be agile and innovative? If people are being less bullish, the longer they're in the organization, it feels like they're almost getting very comfortable. And also, is there cross-mentoring that's happening? Those are probably the two things that are coming up for me as the biggest one. As people get more comfortable, are they innovating? Is the younger energy actually pulling in, and are they able to innovate and to keep up with the speed of market? I'd be curious to see what their numbers are and how responsive they are to the market with that current data point.
Yeah, I mean, what we could have done is we could have even gone a step further. What we could have said is we could have run and we could have looked at specifically the age or tenure, as I showed you right now, and seen how they changes around a question like agility, around experimentation or culture. So is there a commensurate drop around the age or tenure of the organization and their perception of the organization's culture, agility, experimentation, so on and so forth? If there is, then we can see, I think we can then have a decent correlation that says the older you are, the less likely you are to perceive the organization as being able to take risks, as experimenting. The question
Yes.
around, is there reverse mentoring? Is there cross mentoring? That comes through in the qualitative conversations that we have afterwards to say, what do we do? But this then also ties into the previous question around your question around saying, do men create and are they advocating for females? A good piece and a good use case of this data is we see the data, we do a thing, we measure the data. So longitudinally, and then we can measure the efficacy of these programs. But your point is so powerful. Is there any data that shows us a correlation between age or tenure and other metrics? And that would be fascinating to pull that data up beforehand.
Crossover, yeah. So interestingly enough, I mean, this for me, at top of mind for me right now is how anti-fragile is your business? If there's a shockwave that comes, if there's something that impacts, with this generation of leaders who are very comfortable, who seem to be less bullish in the space, are they actually able to absorb the shocks, to learn, adapt, and to almost reinvent themselves? And that would be the question I would ask just based on that, because anti-fragility is the biggest need in every organization right now, because of the level of change that's happening. And just according to that data, I would be concerned about that particular audience and what they're driving from a culture perspective and from an anti-fragility perspective and their ability to navigate it. Brilliant, Craig. Let us move on. I think I'm keen to explore the next piece, and this was a really good segue for us into anti-fragility in our conversation. What I'm keen to look at is our final anchor on anti-fragility and the ability to grow stronger through disruption. If resilience is about bouncing back, anti-fragility is about bouncing forward. In this particular graph, we're going to look at a company that prioritized cost-cutting over skills building and eroding its ability to regenerate. This, for me, really, as I looked at it, was an interesting case study on leadership denial at its core. But let's not give too much away. Let's give you an opportunity to talk through the data and let's unpack it.
Okay. So this graph, you read it the same way. It looks a little bit different because the previous graph that I showed you is part of my commercial tool right now, which I can roll out, and I do roll out to organizations. This one, it's a little bit different. Because this is based during the PhD phase of it. So before I had created a product around it, but the same thing holds true. But I want to walk you through some stuff that's really important. What we're looking at now is, again, we're trying to see the attributes. We're seeing the attributes mapped down circumference, okay? But you're seeing two colored graphs over here. What you're seeing right now is you're seeing blue, which is today, i.e., this is the perception of the organization based on today, the blue, and then orange was the perception of the respondees of the company in the future. Now, again, this is not where we want to be. This is where we think we're going to be, all things being considered of what I've seen. Now, I won't go too much again because of confidentiality, but I will say this was done with a company that became liquidated, right? So without going too much into the context, there were some challenges. There were some questions around financial management. There were some questions around legalities or questions around ethical behavior for this organization. They brought in a new leadership team. The leadership team was in place for approximately 12 to 18 months when we then did this survey. And what comes out tellingly is almost on every single metric across the board over here, the orange is regressed, i.e. it's close to the circumference, i.e. its ratings are smaller than the blue. Orange has a lower rating than blue across almost all metrics. Put an asterisk over there, right? So just in general, by looking at this graph, what we can see is the respondees of this organization said, we don't believe we're going to get better than most, then we're not going to get better in the future around almost all metrics, except for a few, right? The ones where there's a huge delta, the biggest delta is this one over here. That should be the biggest concerning piece over here, leadership. So what it says, yes, we brought a new leadership team. We think they're pretty good. They're a pretty good team. They're 8.1, but they might regress over time as the organization focuses on other stuff. What's the other stuff? Well, the one that jumps out at us the most is profits and shareholder value. And that makes sense from the reason why we changed the board, why we changed the leadership team, is because there were some financial issues, fiduciary issues, bringing a new leadership team to focus on this area. And so how do we interpret this? We interpret it this way. We brought in a new leadership team. They're great today. They may not be great in the future, but they'll do some stuff which they probably should be doing, which is why we brought them in, which is focusing on profits and shareholder value. But it's at the expense of leadership. It's at the expense of a lot of other stuff because their focus is over here, which is what we believe they'll deliver. As it turns out, again, correlation, causation is not the same thing. As it turns out, if you followed and if you knew who this company was, a lot of this kind of stuff does play through over time. And it shows that the failure of this company that did eventually liquidate was because of the leadership team, because of their business, because of lack of focus around technology, but also questions around saying, did we have the right kind of governance in place, which they didn't have in experimentation.
Yeah, this graph in particular, I mean, and the data, it is very, very telling. And I'm so curious as a case study, what it shares around the decisions we make around leadership, the decisions that we make around, from an efficiency, cost efficiency perspective, and governance, deeply, deeply concerning. And that trifecta as data points, it just, for me, is the opposite of an anti-fragile organization. It's all the things that you should not be doing in order to be anti-fragile. And my understanding is the organization did liquidate, but this is almost like this is a data point to actually tell you where the organization's going, right?
Absolutely. And paradoxically, when I did the survey with the team, and after the survey, I showed it to the HR team, and I couldn't get a meeting thereafter with executives. And I don't know, it's because maybe they were so busy. In their defense, maybe they're so busy, they were trying to do what they were mandated to do, which is bring in money, right? But also there's a flip side, which is I showed this data and they were like, well, we don't want to share this with executives. So we'll just put it away in the corner for right now because it'll just detract us from what we should be doing. But I want to bring a thread through some of the conversation we spoke about before. Imagine I had this data and all the data I showed you was the same uniform company. So we've got issues over here from a gender parity point of view. We've got issues over here from an age point of view. We've got issues over here around what is the focus of the organization, right? You can see how all of these pieces tie together into a very strong case study, which then says, are we focusing on the wrong stuff? It's also questions around what is the values of this organization? We say it's A, but it's actually B around profitability and correlation. This gives us a huge lens around essentially the theme of what we're speaking about, right? Which is really about saying, well, how do we think through what does data show us around being anti-fragile? Because again, we often have platitudes. We say stuff, we need to be anti-fragile. Anti-fragility is what we need in the future. But one, do we measure this? Do we even know how to measure it? Okay. And once we do it, are we willing, like this company, this liquidation company, to actually do stuff? And I think this gives us a really great narrative because it's not the data, it's the narrative that we can pull in to say, how do we think about this in the context of your company where you are? And then can we have those hard conversations?
Love what you're saying because it links directly to our workforce readiness thought leadership that we're driving at the moment. So firstly, do I have the visibility? Yes, you've given us the data, you've given us the data points of what we need. Then do we have the right skills in place to help us to drive the right behaviors to be anti-fragile, to be able to navigate? Is the inspiration in place? And as we think about the thread from today, in a lot of cases, it was missing. It was the inability to have the trust, the integrity, all of those components in order to drive it. And then agility, which helps us to then pivot at the speed of market. So what fascinates me is you've given us multiple data points. In a lot of the discussions, organizations haven't used the visibility, the data that they have in order to make changes to the other levers. Instead, they've, as you've just mentioned, maybe just shut down the conversation. And I suppose that's where the courageous leadership is required. Where do we need to make those pivots? And just observationally, what I'm noticing from the data and from the discussion today is that there's an ingredient required to make all of this happen, and it's the human element. It's that courageous leadership. It's the ability to that authenticity, to be able to engage, to look at it with honesty and integrity and say, if this is what the data is telling us, what do we need to do differently? And look in the mirror and actually say, as an organization and as a leadership team, what do we need to do differently to pivot as a result? And I think that's the power of the conversation, that anti-fragility are key concepts, but it's the human being that actually makes it happen and makes it come alive, and the courage to actually, make those things happen. And we're seeing data points that are a result of human decisions and human interaction and engagement. And I think that always sits at the core of our conversations.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, Nadia. And I think it's such an apt point, you know. And again, I don't want to tie into AI because that's beyond the scope of this conversation. But my concern is, as we bring in more of this automation stuff, whether it's true AI, whether it's just business process engineering, whatever it might be, we start shelving the person to the side, and we start going to what we said earlier. It's about profits, about making money, right? I think the human-centered conversation here is do we have the visibility? Can we have the transparency and can we have the honesty around this conversation that needs to be had? For a lot of the companies that I've shown this, I'm going to say about 60% of them go, that's interesting, cool. Nothing even follows up, right? Maybe 20% shut down the conversation straight away. This is not what we need to see. We've got other priorities. This is great. You actually validated that we're doing the right stuff. About 20%, maybe 10 to 20% actually do something about it, right? And I think this is the paradox, is the challenge that we have, because the data doesn't fit a narrative that's kept in echo chambers of executives, because we don't want to see the nastiness, because it's hard work to do the stuff around the human being, around the leadership stuff versus the organization stuff.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, just to build on that, I think that's sitting at the core, because if we really take the data and honestly ask ourselves those questions, there's big changes that we need to make internally, and it does take a live and that is fundamentally one of the hardest things for us to do as individual human beings and also as organizations. So really love that. I think that was such a fantastic point. And for me, at the core of this, as I think about anti-fragile organizations and where they're doing well, they're able to reinvent themselves. They're able to pivot at speed. They're able to question if their products are still actually meeting the market need and make those changes. So visibility without the courage to execute, I think, is ultimately where organizations fall flat and are unable to be anti-fragile, because as you said, it can easily be shut down and things don't move. And what we're looking at now are organizations who are actually able to make those pivots. And those are the ones that are going to survive and thrive in our current context. I see we have about 2 minutes to go. Just wanted to thank everyone. I see a few questions have come in and statements as well. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining this webinar. It's the first of a series that we're going to be doing every quarter. As LRMG, we're going to be inviting our leaders in for conversation to create a community of practice. It's really important for us to support each other through the challenges that we're experiencing, and for LRMG to support our clients. So just wanted to thank you all for joining us. You'll see on the screen there is a QR code. This is our Workforce Readiness Compass. You can scan the code, and it's a diagnostic that we offer to our clients. So you're welcome to scan that, connect with us, and have a conversation around the workforce readiness gaps that speak to visibility, skills, agility and inspiration that we've spoken about today. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today, and a special thanks to you, Craig Wing, for a powerful and thought-provoking conversation. Always enjoy my conversations with you. Triggers thinking, allows us to shift and also understand how we can do what we can do differently. So thank you for that. As we've seen, becoming anti-fragile isn't about bouncing back. It's about building systems, skills, and spirit to grow stronger through disruption. Thank you again for your energy and engagement, and we look forward to seeing you at the next LRMG Jolt conversation. Thank you, everyone.